Merry readers, come cozy in. Let the story time begin with Robin and the Marys.
Hi Merry Readers! So today is September 25th, and that means it is time for Chapter 8 of A Discovery of Witches. This chapter picks up the next day from where Chapter 7 left off, where Matthew is picking up Diana for the yoga class. This is one of my favorite chapters in the whole book. It's a little bit of an underrated chapter, I think, for many people, but for me, it's really where I fell in love with these characters. So I'm so excited to share a little bit about this chapter and my thoughts with you. So Matthew is leaning against his jaguar, he's in his yoga clothes, and Diana comes out and she teases him immediately for saying how ridiculous it is to have such a flashy car and, you know, just playful teasing. And so she gets in the car and they start driving, and right away she asks Matthew where they're going because she notices that they're driving out of Oxford, and he says that the class is a little bit outside of the city, but it's absolutely worth it. And so at first Diana's feeling a little hesitant and Matthew offers to take her back, but she decides to trust him and go to this class. Then she's in her head a little bit and she's starting to stress about getting all of her research done because she has a conference coming up in November and it's almost October and she hasn't gotten enough research done to be able to present anything. So she's kind of in her head, and Matthew looks at her and says, just listen to the music, you can't be stressed out if you're listening to Mozart. So they are just relaxing in the car, and finally they come up to a big gate and they go through the gate after Matthew puts in a code, and then they go through a second gate, and in front of them a huge Tudor house rises, and Diana is just amazed because she knows that this is a historic manor house and it's just so beautiful. So they park, Matthew brings her inside, and they come to a room where there's a bunch of shoes outside, and Matthew stops Diana outside of the room and he turns to her and says, I know I told you that this is a mixed class, but I mean that more than just a mixed skill class for yoga. This is a class that's just for creatures, and the only way to get into the room is to be one of us. And so he opens the door, and Diana immediately sees that everyone inside is either a witch, a demon, or a vampire. And she's surprised because she's never been to a class like this and she's not used to creatures getting along together like this. She walks inside and a woman walks up to them, and Matthew introduces her to Diana and says this is Amira. She is the instructor for this class, and Amira is thrilled to meet Diana. She says that Matthew had given her a heads up that Diana would be joining them this evening, and Amira takes Diana's hands, and when she does, all of Diana's stress disappears. And so Diana feels so calm for the first time, and Amira leads the two of them over to a back corner and says, I think that this is where you'll be the most comfortable. And so they sit down. Diana immediately falls into her normal yoga poses, and she really enjoys the class because she notices that Amira takes them through all of these poses that speak a little bit to their natural instincts as creatures. So there's poses that really get the vampires, that are a little bit more fast-paced. There's poses that help the demons to settle down a little bit and not go flying off of the floor. They have a funny scene where during one of the poses she has them pretend that they're light as a feather, and some of the creatures actually float off the ground and she has to remind them to stay grounded. So it's just a really fun class overall. And then at the end they go into their savasana, which is a corpse pose or just a very calm pose that you do at the end of yoga classes. And Diana has a really hard time with this. It's uncomfortable. She immediately starts feeling her anxiety rise, and Amira comes over and says, oh, Diana, this pose is not for you, and puts Diana on her side into a pose that she feels so much more comfortable in, and she's able to actually relax and go into the meditation at the end of the class with the others. And then finally, when they're brought back from the meditation, she and Matthew hang out a little bit longer, and Amira ends up saying for them to just close up, and then Matthew asks Diana if she would like to go to the gatehouse to have a cup of tea. And so Diana asks if there's a cafe there or something, and Matthew kind of chuckles at her and says, no, I can make a cup of tea. And at that moment she looks at him and she asks Matthew, is this your house? And he says yes. He had it built in 1536 after King Henry had given him the land as a prize during the Reformation. And so he said that during that time, King Henry was very upset and didn't want anything to remain of the abbey that had originally stood there. But Matthew had been able to keep a few of the original characteristics, but otherwise the house was completely a new build. And Diana couldn't believe that anyone would be saying that something built in 1536 would be considered new, but for Matthew it was a new build. And so she agrees to go for tea. They walk down together. Matthew puts on tea. She admires all of Matthew's taste in his little gatehouse, and he explains that he normally stays there on the weekends and then he stays in Oxford during the week. And so Diana asks a few questions about the class, and he explains that back during the time when people were going to the East Indies and the West Indies, he had gone to the East Indies and he had learned how to do yoga from some of the masters of that time. And over the years, he found that most yoga instructors had lost that original flair that people that he had learned from had, until he met Amira, and he had offered her that she could use his house if she was willing to do a mixed creatures class as well as help humans. So she does both creature classes and human classes throughout the week, and he said that she was willing to give it a go, and happily she had been with him for almost 10 years at that point, and the classes were so popular that they almost sold out every single week. So Diana is just amazed because she's never heard of creatures being able to work together like this, and Matthew is intrigued by this. They sit down, they have their tea. Diana again makes a perfect cup of tea, and she notices that there's a portrait of a beautiful woman over the fireplace, and so she asks about it, and Matthew explains that that is his sister, Louisa, and that she has sadly passed, and Diana asks what happened to her, and he explains that during the same time that he had gone to the East Indies, she had gone to Barbados, but she really played into all of the vices of the times, and so she was an avid slave owner, and she had wanted to become a queen of Barbados, and so her greed overtook her, and the locals actually had her killed and blamed it on the slaves. They burned her, they chopped her up. And so Diana feels bad for Matthew, and she says, I'm sorry, but Matthew says, I loved my sister, but she got the death that she deserved because of the kind of person that she was. He said that she really just couldn't help herself, and she was never a good person. So that was kind of a little bit of a clue into Diana that Matthew has family members. And then as they're talking more, she wants to hear more about the house and how it was built, and they talk a little bit more about that until finally they come to talking more about the yoga class. And Diana says that she feels like we all look the same on the outside, but it's hard to feel that way when you're looking around because everyone feels so different. And Matthew finds this to be totally a weird thing to say, and so he asks Diana more about what she means, and she says, well, when you look around the room, you can feel if someone's a witch, if someone's a demon, if someone's a vampire. And Matthew shakes his head. He has no idea what she's talking about. And so she asks him, you can't feel what people are, and Matthew shakes his head no again, and so he wants to know some more about it. But as he's asking these follow-up questions, Diana starts to feel like it's a trap, but she answers honestly. She says that when it's a vampire, she feels like there's ice growing under her skin. She says that demons are the worst because it feels like they're kissing her on her skin. And so she's talking, and finally Matthew says, aha, so you do use your magic then on a regular basis. And Diana feels like the trap door shuts. And so she gets very defensive, and she says, I wish that I had never opened Ashmole 782. I really don't use my magic. I'd only used it 5 times this year, but now it seems like I have to use it every single day. And she just kind of spirals out, and Matthew stops her and says, Diana, I don't care if you use magic, but I'm a little bit surprised that you care so much. And Diana then starts to go into a little bit more vulnerability about how she doesn't like using magic because her parents were killed because of it, and she just wants to be normal. And Matthew shares that there's no such thing as being normal. That's a fairy tale that people tell children, but no one can live a normal life that is free of danger. Even the humans are not safe from danger. And then he shares a little bit about how Isaac Newton was able to discover the laws of gravity by not sticking with the status quo and believing that some things that were not seen were in fact in charge of what was dictating what we now call gravity. And then he shares a little bit about some failed philosophers too. Specifically, he talks about Robert Hooke and how he did not let himself go and he stuck to the laws that he already knew, and therefore he never really reached his full potential. And so Diana is really defensive during this. She really doesn't understand what Matthew is getting at, and Matthew gets frustrated too, and finally he just says, you know what, Diana, I think that it's time for me to take you home. But Diana tries to save it at that point, and she says, listen, we're both interested in Ashmole 782. Even if we can't be friends, I don't understand why we can't work together to try to figure out what Ashmole 782 means. And Matthew says, I'm really not sure if we can work together. And so they get in the car and they drive home, and it's just a really quiet, awkward ride home for both of them from Oxford. And finally, Diana is thinking about how she has all these preconceived conceptions of, she has all of these thoughts, and those thoughts were that they are bloodthirsty and very scary, but she says that Matthew is none of these things, but in fact he's very calculated, and it's more of his sternness and his outbursts of anger, abrupt mood changes that scare her, not that he's bloodthirsty. And so she gets home, he curtly says goodbye to her, she curtly says goodbye to him, he says have a nice weekend, and they part ways. And Diana's left kind of in this place of thinking about all of this. And that is the end of chapter 8. So now I'll go into the questions for this chapter. So our settings for this chapter is the Old Lodge, of course. It's the Jaguar car, again, to start with. Then it's going through to the Old Lodge. Then we have the yoga studio, which is in the grand ballroom of the house. Then we have the gatehouse and the tea room in the gatehouse, and just this very cozy vibe there. And then of course we have the Jaguar on the ride back. For characters, there's Diana again, there's Matthew. We get to know Amira a little bit. We learn about Louisa, Matthew's sister, and there's some other characters, but they don't have names. So we see a lot of witches and vampires and demons at the yoga class as well. So for historical and academic Easter eggs, there were a bunch in this. So there's the Reformation, which I think is also a foreshadow, where we're going to hear more about Matthew's part in the Reformation during King Henry's reign. There's Isaac Newton and Robert Hooke, which those are real people, and all of the philosophies that Matthew talks about in this chapter are accurate in terms of what the two men studied and their limitations and successes. And then of course there's alchemy and yoga and the history of both of those, which come up throughout this chapter as well. So lots of little academic and historic Easter eggs in this chapter. Then for Magic Watch, I think that the big thing is really that Matthew calls Diana out on her daily use of magic. So it's coming out in little ways that I don't think she's even aware of as being magical uses, such as identifying who's a vampire, who's a witch, who's a demon every single day when she walks into a room. And I think this really shook Diana, where she wasn't prepared to be called out in this way. And I don't know if she even realized that what she was doing was using magic. So the mood of this chapter, it begins with a lot of banter and some kind of tension and excitement of getting to the class. It goes into a zen, serene, happy vibe throughout the class. Then it goes into this kind of inquisitive, philosophical place at the gatehouse, and then it turns to anger and tension and frustration by the end of it, where Matthew and Diana leave each other and they're just really frustrated with each other because it did not go well. Symbols, motives, and details. So for this chapter we have the yoga class, which is just a really nice detail to add in because it allowed for Diana and Matthew to do something a little bit out of the ordinary, and I just love the details of doing yoga. I'm a big yoga person myself, so that was really, really fun for me. I appreciated that because you don't often read about yoga classes either. The portrait of Louisa was a really interesting way to introduce a little bit more about Matthew's family without it feeling like just blatantly, this is my sister. So I thought that was really nice. The tea ritual again, seeing Diana make her tea perfect again, was just some continuity that I really appreciated too. And then there's just the historical little parts of talking about real philosophers, and I just love that there's so much real history woven into this story because it makes it feel like this really could be a reality of our world that's living right under our noses. So for romance, I think that there was a lot of trust being built throughout this chapter. So there was the trust Diana had in Matthew to bring her to this class. There was trust that they both had in each other to be vulnerable during the class. And then there was trust to have tea with each other. Even though it ended in a tense way, I think that this was a building trust chapter. So I think that there's a lot to come from that, and we'll see where Diana and Matthew go, but I think that this was a really important chapter for them because they needed to have everything rocked a little bit and to have some more reality set in for both of them about what's really going on. So I think the overall vibe, some people may disagree, but I think this is a very powerful chapter. I think we learn a lot in this chapter. There's so many fun details in this chapter, so I think overall this is definitely one of my favorite chapters. There's more later that I think are really powerful, but I think for an early chapter, this one really sticks out to me as being super powerful and super interesting and just where I really fell in love with both of them. So I talked a little bit already about the foreshadowing. I think that Diana's daily use of magic is definitely going to become more of a prominent part of the book as we go forward. I think that we see a little bit more of Matthew's issues with anger management and just this constant talk about wolves and his parallel to wolves. I think that him being so protective and him having these flares and mood swings and anger are going to become more and more prevalent as we go through the book. And then I think that this idea that creatures can coexist, even if it's just in a little yoga class, is really telling to what could be as we go forward with the rest of the book, because maybe the segregation of the creatures is not how it should be anymore, and maybe we're seeing a little bit of that in this class. So I really think that there is a lot of foreshadowing in this particular chapter. The question for this chapter that I'm going to leave for us to discuss in the comments is, do you think Matthew was right? Can Diana ever truly pass as human? Or do you think he was a little bit too harsh in pushing her? Thank you all for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed. I can't wait to hear your thoughts below. Tomorrow we will have 2 chapters again, so I will be posting them in 2 separate videos at the same time, and that will be for chapters 9 and 10. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Bye!
So many readers, close your eyes. Let the stories lift and rise. Till next time, when lights will gleam.